As the Voth Council filed into the Grand Chamber and took their seats, Scott stood alone at the center of the room, a stack of evidence files clutched in his hands. He faced the stern visage of Councillor Boron, the Voth leader presiding over the negotiations. Scott took a deep breath and began his presentation. Councillors, I come before you today to address the unprovoked attacks on human colonies by Voth forces. These files contain irrefutable proof of the destruction and loss of life caused by your military's actions. Scott held up the stack of files, his voice steady and resolute. On behalf of the United Earth Government, I demand that the Voth cease their aggression immediately. Boron leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Ambassador Scott, the Voth Empire will not be lectured by a species as primitive as yours. Your colonies are encroaching on our rightful territory. Any actions taken by our forces are justified in defending our sovereignty. Scott's jaw clenched. With all due respect, Councillor, those colonies are well within the boundaries established by the Galactic Treaty. The Voth have no legal claim to them. Legal claim? Boron scoffed. Your treaties mean nothing to us. The Voth are the most technologically advanced civilization in the galaxy. Your weapons are obsolete compared to our might. Your concerns are irrelevant. Tensions in the room rose as Scott argued passionately, his voice echoing off the chamber walls. The human race has every right to defend itself against aggression. We may not have your level of technology, but we will not stand idly by while our people are slaughtered. The Voth Council members whispered among themselves, unmoved by Scott's pleas. Boron opened his mouth to respond, when suddenly a piercing alarm blared throughout the chamber. The councillors looked around in confusion as a Voth officer burst into the room, his face pale. Councillor Boron, the officer shouted over the alarm. A human fleet has entered Zephiria's orbit, led by a massive warship called the UES Retribution. They're armed with nuclear missiles. Scott's eyes widened in shock. He had no knowledge of any human fleet being dispatched to Zephyria. He maintained his composure, but his mind raced with questions. Boron turned to Scott, his eyes blazing with anger. What is the meaning of this, Ambassador? Is this a trick? I assure you, Councillor, I had no idea about any fleet being sent here, Scott replied honestly, holding up his hands. I am just as surprised as you are. The Voth Council erupted into chaos, with members shouting and pointing accusingly at Scott. Boron silenced them with a raised hand, his voice booming through the chamber. Ambassador Scott, you will be placed under guard in your quarters while we deliberate our response to this blatant act of aggression. 2 Voth guards stepped forward and flanked Scott, escorting him out of the council chambers. As they walked through the corridors, Scott overheard a hushed conversation between Boron and another councillor, Sark. Do you think their nuclear weapons could penetrate our shields? Sark asked, a hint of concern in his voice. It's unlikely, but we can't afford to underestimate them, Boron replied. We must prepare for the worst. Scott's mind raced as he processed this information. Despite the Voth's advanced technology, they seemed genuinely worried about the potential effectiveness of human nuclear weapons. Perhaps they weren't as invulnerable as they claimed. Once inside his quarters, Scott wasted no time. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, sleek device, a quantum entanglement communicator. Scott activated it, his fingers flying over the controls as he established a secure link with the UES Retribution. The device crackled to life. Ambassador Scott, this is Admiral Jacob Novak. What's your status? Admiral, I had no idea the fleet was coming, Scott said, keeping his voice low. What's going on? We received credible intelligence that the Voth were planning a full-scale invasion of human space. The government authorized the deployment as a show of force to deter them. Scott rubbed his chin thoughtfully. I overheard something during the council meeting. The Voth seem worried that our nukes could penetrate their shields. There was a pause on the other end. That's valuable information, Ambassador. I'll hold off on any offensive action until we know more. See what you can find out. Understood, Admiral. Scott out. He ended the transmission just as a knock sounded at his door. Scott opened it to find Zor, his Voth guard, standing outside. The young soldier looked nervous, his eyes darting around the corridor. "Ambassador Scott, I need to speak with you," Zor said, his voice urgent. "I have doubts about my government's actions towards your people. I want to help." Scott ushered him inside, closing the door. "I'm glad to hear that, Zor. I could use your assistance. We need to access the Voth military database to find out if they have any weaknesses we can exploit." Zor hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I can get you in, but we'll have to be careful. If we're caught—" "How we won't be," Scott assured him. "Let's go." The two made their way through the Voth compound, Zor leading them down a series of winding corridors. They reached a heavily guarded door, and Zor swiped his access card, motioning for Scott to follow him inside. The room was filled with terminals, each one displaying complex schematics and data streams. Zor sat at one of the consoles and began typing rapidly, his fingers a blur on the holographic keys. "I'm in," he said after a few tense minutes. "What exactly are we looking for?" Scott leaned over his shoulder, scanning the files. "Anything related to their shields, specifically how they hold up against nuclear weapons." Zor searched through the database, his brow furrowed in concentration. Suddenly he let out a low whistle. "I think I've found something." He brought up a series of test results, showing the Voth's attempts to develop countermeasures against nuclear weapons. The documents revealed that while their energy shields could withstand conventional human armaments, they were vulnerable to the intense radiation and electromagnetic pulses generated by nuclear explosions. Scott's eyes widened as he read through the files. "This is it, Zor. This is the key to bringing the Voth to the negotiating table." He activated his quantum entanglement communicator once more, contacting Admiral Novak. "Admiral, I have the information we need. The Voth shields can't withstand a nuclear attack. I have a plan to force them to negotiate in good faith, but I need your help." Scott and Zor burst into the council chambers, the heavy doors slamming against the walls. The Voth councillors, caught in the midst of a heated argument, whipped their heads around to face the intruders. Boron's eyes narrowed as he recognized Scott, his voice dripping with contempt. "Ambassador Scott, you dare return here after your blatant act of aggression?" Scott strode forward, his jaw set with determination. He held up a data pad, the screen displaying the damning evidence of the Voth's vulnerability. "Councillors, I have proof that your shields are useless against our nuclear weapons. Your own military records confirm it." The chamber erupted into a frenzy of shouting and accusations. Boron slammed his fist on the table, silencing the room. "Lies! No primitive human technology could penetrate our defenses." "I assure you, Councillor, this information is very real," Scott said, his voice steady. "I demand that the Voth agree to an immediate ceasefire and withdraw all forces from human territory. Failure to comply will result in this evidence being transmitted to the UES Retribution." Boron's face contorted with rage. He pointed a clawed finger at Zor. You helped this human access our classified files. You are a traitor to your own kind." Zor stepped forward, his voice clear and unwavering. "No, Councillor. I am loyal to the Voth, but our aggressive policies towards humanity are wrong. We must seek peace, not war." The Voth guards, hearing Boron's accusation, moved to seize Zor and Scott. Suddenly a blinding flash illuminated the chamber, followed by a deafening boom that shook the very foundation of the building. The UES Retribution's nuclear warhead detonated in Zephiria's upper atmosphere, sending an electromagnetic pulse, cascading across the planet's surface. The council chambers plunged into darkness as the Voth's energy shields flickered and died. Consoles sparked and sputtered, and the guards' weapons fizzled out, rendered useless by the EMP. In the ensuing chaos, Scott and Zor sprang into action. Scott's human combat training kicked in as he disarmed the nearest guard with a swift strike to the wrist. He grabbed the guard's energy staff and tossed it to Zor, who caught it deftly. Together, they fought their way through the disoriented Voth, Scott's agility and Zor's knowledge of the building's layout giving them the upper hand. Zor led Scott down a side corridor, the sounds of shouting and pursuit echoing behind them. He pressed his hand against a seemingly blank wall, and a hidden door slid open, revealing a narrow escape tunnel. "This way," Zor urged, ducking inside. Scott followed close behind, the door sealing shut just as the Voth guards rounded the corner. The two men ran through the dimly lit tunnel, their breaths coming in short gasps. Zor navigated the twists and turns with practiced ease, guiding them towards the surface. As they emerged into the chaos of the Voth city, sirens wailing and buildings darkened by the EMP, Scott activated his quantum entanglement communicator. "Admiral Novak, the Voth's shields are down. I repeat, their shields are down. We have a window of opportunity to force their hand." There was a crackle of static. Then Admiral Novak's voice filled the air. "Understood, Ambassador. We'll begin our approach. Rendezvous at the designated coordinates for extraction." Scott turned to Zor, a newfound respect in his eyes. "Thank you, Zor. Your bravery may have just changed the course of history." Zor nodded solemnly. "I only hope that our people can find a way to coexist peacefully. The path ahead will not be easy." The two men set off into the city, the weight of their actions hanging heavy in the air. The fate of two civilizations, human and Voth, now rested on the outcome of the coming negotiations. Scott and Zor raced through the darkened streets of the Voth city. The stolen energy staff clutched tightly in Zor's hand. The spaceport loomed ahead, a sprawling complex of gleaming metal and pulsing energy fields. As they approached the main entrance, a squad of heavily armed Voth guards emerged from the shadows, their weapons trained on the two fugitives. "Hold it right there!" one of the guards shouted, his voice amplified by his helmet's external speakers. "Drop your weapons and surrender!" Scott and Zor exchanged a quick glance, their faces set with determination. They had come too far to give up now. With a nod, they charged forward, dodging the guards' plasma bolts as they returned fire. Zor's aim was true, and two guards fell to the ground, their armor smoking from the energy staff's blasts. Scott, relying on his human agility, closed the distance and engaged the remaining guards in hand-to-hand combat. He ducked under a swinging rifle butt and drove his fist into the guard's midsection, doubling him over. As they fought their way through the spaceport, alarms blared and more guards poured in from all directions. Zor led Scott to a sleek black ship at the far end of the landing pad. "That's our ride," he said, pointing to the vessel. "It's a prototype stealth ship designed for covert operations." They sprinted towards the ship, plasma bolts sizzling past their heads. Suddenly a figure stepped out from behind the ship, blocking their path. It was Boron, his eyes blazing with fury. "You traitors," he roared, leveling his plasma rifle at them. "Did you really think you could escape?" Zor stepped forward, his energy staff crackling with power. "Boron, it's over. The humans have proven that they can stand against us. We need to end this war before it destroys us all." Boron sneered. "I will never surrender to these primitives. If I must die, I will take you with me." He opened fire, a barrage of plasma bolts streaking towards them. Scott and Zor dove for cover, returning fire as they ran. They weaved between the ships, using them as shields against Boron's relentless assault. Zor took aim and fired, his energy staff's blast catching Boron in the shoulder and spinning him around. They reached the stealth ship, and Zor slammed his hand against the access panel. The hatch hissed open and they leaped inside. Scott slid into the pilot's seat, his hands flying over the unfamiliar controls as Zor sealed the hatch behind them. Plasma bolts hammered against the ship's hull as Boron's guards caught up to them. Scott gritted his teeth and fired the engines, the ship lurching off the landing pad and into the sky. Zor, manning the rear turret, returned fire, the ship's advanced weapons cutting through the guards' armor like paper. As they rocketed away from the spaceport, Zor suddenly cried out in pain. Scott glanced back and saw him slumped over the turret controls, a smoking hole in his chest. "Zor!" he shouted, his heart pounding. "I'm hit," Zor gasped, his breathing labored. "But don't worry about me, just get us to your ship." Scott nodded grimly and pushed the engines to their limit. The stealth ship screamed through Zephyria's atmosphere, Voth fighters in hot pursuit. He wove through their plasma fire, the ship's advanced sensors guiding him through the chaos. As they approached the UES Retribution, Scott opened a channel to the human flagship. "Admiral Novak, this is Ambassador Scott. I have Zor with me, and he's been critically wounded. We need immediate medical attention." There was a burst of static. Then Admiral Novak's voice filled the cockpit. "Ambassador, the Voth fleet has recovered from the EMP and is engaging our ships. We're taking heavy fire. I don't know if we can lower our shields to bring you aboard." Scott glanced back at Zor, who was growing paler by the second. He made a split-second decision. "Admiral, I'm going to beam Zor directly to your medical bay. Have your team standing by." "Understood, Ambassador. What about you?" Scott's jaw tightened. "I'm going to take this ship and join the fight. I have a score to settle with the Voth." He inputted the coordinates for the Retribution's medical bay and activated the ship's transporter. Zor's body shimmered and vanished in a swirl of blue light. Scott whispered a silent prayer for his friend, then turned his attention to the battle raging above. The Voth fleet, despite the damage inflicted by the EMP, was still a formidable force. Their ships, bristling with advanced weapons, swarmed the human vessels like angry hornets. The UES Retribution, a massive battleship, was at the center of the maelstrom, its shields flaring as it absorbed the brunt of the Voth assault. Scott gripped the controls tightly and plunged into the fray. The stealth ship, with its advanced cloaking technology and powerful weapons, was a deadly addition to the human fleet. He darted between the Voth ships, his knowledge of their tactics and weak points guiding his every move. He targeted their shield generators and weapons arrays, his precise strikes crippling the Voth vessels one by one. The human ships, emboldened by Scott's actions, pressed their advantage, their own weapons tearing through the weakened Voth defenses. The tide of the battle turned, the once proud Voth fleet reduced to a handful of battered ships. They began to retreat, their engines flaring as they fled into the depths of space. Scott, his heart pounding with a mixture of exhilaration and grief, guided the stealth ship back to the Retribution. As he stepped onto the bridge, Admiral Novak greeted him with a somber expression. "Ambassador, I have some bad news. Zor, he didn't make it. His injuries were too severe." Scott closed his eyes, a wave of sorrow washing over him. Zor, the brave Voth soldier who had risked everything to help him, was gone. He took a deep breath and opened his eyes, his gaze fixed on the viewscreen. The last of the Voth ships disappeared into the void, their retreat a grim reminder of the challenges that lay ahead. The war was far from over, but humanity had proven itself a force to be reckoned with, even in the face of a technologically superior enemy. Scott stood on the bridge of the Retribution, watching as the stars streaked past. He knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he also knew that humanity would never give up. They would fight, they would endure, and in the end, they would prevail. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.